Jamie here. I'm out in the cold Adelaide right now, my hometown of course, and I want to talk about a concept that was taught to me about a year and a half ago from a mentor of mine. And that concept is that high risk is really low risk, and low risk is usually a high risk. Let's first talk about low risk, right? What is low risk in entrepreneurship? Well, low risk would be only working the hours you get paid for. That makes pretty good sense, right? If you get paid a certain amount, then you should only be working to that amount. That's a low risk. That makes perfect sense. Or does it? What about not using credit cards or not taking investors' cash to launch your product? Well, that seems like a low risk. Use your own cash, launch it out slowly, then you don't owe the banks any cash, you don't have a high credit card, you don't have to answer to some high annoying investor. You can launch at your own pace using your own capital, right? That makes sense. That is a low risk choice, okay? And of course, paying yourself first, right? That is a low risk. You want to ensure that cash ends up in your pocket. You want to drain the cash from the company or from the product to pay yourself first, because after all, you're in business, you're a entrepreneur to fund your lifestyle, right? So you want to take that cash and pay yourself first, because that is a low risk long term. If the business blows up, that's okay. You've got cash because you took a low risk approach and you paid yourself first. So those three examples were to not take capital, to only work the hours you're paid to work, and to pay yourself first as well. So if all of those are classed as a low risk, you really have to ask yourself, is that a low risk? Like, is the long-term approach of those three examples a low risk? If you're not taking investors' cash to launch your product quicker, well, will your product ever get launched? Probably not. If you're only working the hours you get paid to work, how long will you be a entrepreneur for? Like, really? If you're not putting in the extra work, the overtime, and providing clients with that amazing experience, and you're only putting in the work that you get paid for, then that's a high risk, right? So what we class as a low risk up front, a low risk for the next week or the next 2 weeks, is actually a high risk if you play it out 1 to 10 years, right? Because if you're not taking the cash to grow the company, if you're not putting in the extra work that you might not be paid for now, and if you're paying yourself first as opposed to putting into advertising, as opposed to hiring the right team that will grow their business quicker, then that's a high risk. So what we class as a low risk up front, right, not taking that initial risk, not putting yourself on the edge, is actually a long-term high risk, because you're not likely to end up at a place where you're going to win. So low risk is actually a high risk in the long term, okay? So while we might think to ourselves, I won't take this risk, it's a very low risk approach, I should be fine. You're probably not fine. If you play it out long term, it's probably a very, very high risk to play the low risk card now. So again, if we flip that and we look at, well, what would we deem a high risk today, right? What would be a high risk for us? Well, a high risk for us would be to work for the hours that we're not paid to work. Now that would be classed as a high risk because you would get tired, you might miss out on social events, and you're just working a lot. So that could be classed as a high risk up front. But if you're putting in a large amount of unpaid work, eventually you're going to get compensated for that work. So if you're putting in a lot of work up front, as opposed to only doing the work that you're paid to do, then that might be a high risk over the next month. But play it out 1, 2, 3, 4 years, that would be a low risk, because you're going to end up in a place where you are going to win. Again, if you're taking capital, whether it be from an investor, from a bank, well, that might be an incredible high risk, massive high risk, because you have to answer to the investor, you have to pay back the bank every month, massive high risk. But you're able to launch things quicker, you're able to hire that team, you're able to grow the brand, the company a lot quicker, which means long term, speeding up the process through taking capital is actually a low risk if you do it right. Okay, so what we might class as a high risk today is actually a low risk when we align it to our end outcome, right? So by taking the high risk today, it makes it more likely for us to actually hit our outcomes. Thus, long-term, a high risk is actually low risk, and the low risk is actually the high risk, because taking the low risk approach won't allow us to hit our outcomes because we're taking the safe route, okay? So we're not taking that high risk that will end up paying off in the end. So that's how it applies to entrepreneurship. So high risk is low risk is high risk. Cool, got it. Great. Now, I'm gonna cut to a video that I filmed in June, I think, about me talking to a room of new graduates of the McGuire Program. For those of you who are unaware, the McGuire Program is a program that helps people with speaking impediments, like myself, to really communicate more eloquently. Okay, so I want to cut to that clip now where I'm talking about high risk versus low risk once again. This concept is all about how high risk is really a low risk, and low risk is actually a high risk. Let me clarify that. The term low risk for the new and returning graduates could be classed as not pushing outside your comfort zone because it feels uncomfortable. You might feel some fear. You could be afraid that you might make a mistake, so you do not push outside your comfort zone because that is a low risk. You might avoid challenging situations, words or phrases, because that is a low risk in the short term. But in the long term, it's extremely high risk. You're going to relapse, and you won't end up to a place where you're going to win. On the opposite side, if you take a high risk doing contacts, making conscious efforts to push outside your comfort zone, feeling uncomfortable, feeling the fear and doing it anyway, those can all be classed as a high risk. However, in the long term, the chances of you not succeeding are very low. So a high risk environment where you feel uncomfortable is actually going to end up being a low risk in terms of your recovery. So go out there and take high risks.